The first motorcycle came around the bend at 7:52 in the morning, when Roy Calhoun was still trying to get his second cup of coffee to stay down. By 7:58, there were 11 of them. By 8:04, the sound had stopped being a sound and become something closer to weather, a low rolling thunder that didn't pass overhead so much as settle into the ground and stay there. By 8:10, the front parking lot of Marsh County High School could not hold any more motorcycles, and they were lining up 2 and 3 deep along Route 9, engines idling, chrome catching the early sun like something out of a fever dream. 300 of them, maybe more. Nobody was in a position to count. Inside the building, Principal Denise Acaffer stood at her office window with the blinds pinched between 2 fingers, watching leather-clad figures dismount in a silence that was somehow louder than the engines had been. She had been principal for 6 years. She had handled a bomb threat, 2 custody dispute kidnappings, and 1 incident involving a raccoon that got into the cafeteria during a fire drill. Nothing in her training had prepared her for this. A junior named Tyler Brask pressed his face to the gymnasium window and said, to no one in particular, "Are we being raided?" Down the hall, in a history classroom with a cracked ceiling tile he'd been asking maintenance to fix since September, a man named Walter Doss set down a stack of essays on the Missouri Compromise and looked out at the parking lot with the specific dread of a man who already suspects the answer to a question he hasn't asked yet. Because here was the strange part. Within minutes, word moved through the building faster than the office could send out an announcement, and the word was always the same. They're asking for Mr. Doss. So the question hung in the air of Marsh County High School like smoke that wouldn't clear. What could a 51-year-old history teacher, a man who drove a Honda Civic with 190,000 miles on it and kept a coffee mug that said World's OKAYESD teacher on his desk, possibly have done to bring 300 bikers to a public high school on a Tuesday morning? To understand that, you have to go back, not far, just 24 hours. Walter Doss had not always wanted to be ordinary, but life has a way of sanding a person down. 10 years ago he'd had a wife, a house with a porch swing, and dreams of writing a book about the Lewis and Clark expedition that he was certain would finally make people care about primary sources again. Now he had an apartment above a laundromat, a divorce that had taken the porch swing and most of his savings, and a habit of eating dinner standing up at the kitchen counter, because sitting down alone at a table felt like an admission of something. He was, by any fair measure, a good teacher, not a flashy one. He didn't do the TikTok dances some of the younger staff did to get kids engaged. He just knew history cold, told it like it actually mattered, and had a tendency to stay 40 minutes after the bell helping kids who needed it, kids other teachers had quietly given up on. He was also, by his own private estimation, about 2 bad years from quitting altogether. The pay hadn't moved in 3 years. The new vice principal corrected his grammar in staff meetings. And 6 months ago his ex-wife had started dating a podiatrist named Greg who drove a truck that cost more than Walter made in a year, which was a detail Walter hated himself for knowing, and hated himself more for thinking about as often as he did. So when Sierra Mercer walked into his 5th period class for the first time in September, Walter didn't notice anything remarkable about her. She sat in the 3rd row, did her work, asked sharp questions about the Homestead Act that suggested she'd actually done the reading, and said almost nothing else. It took him 3 weeks to learn her last name carried weight in Marsh County, and not the kind that opened doors. Sierra's father was Dutch Mercer, not a nickname so much as the only name anyone in 3 counties had used for him in 30 years, and Dutch was the road captain of a chapter that most of the town referred to, with varying degrees of fear and exaggeration, as the Hells Angels. Whether that was technically accurate didn't matter much in Marsh County. What mattered was the patch, the noise on Friday nights when the chapter rolled out together, and the stories, most of them at least 40% invented, that had calcified into local legend over 2 decades. Sierra had grown up inside that legend without ever being asked if she wanted to live there. She was 16, carried a 3.8 GPA, wanted to study marine biology, and had exactly one friend in the entire school, a quiet boy named Pranav who ran cross-country and didn't care whose daughter she was. Everyone else kept their distance. Teachers graded her a little harder, as if daring her to prove she belonged. Students whispered when she walked past, stories about knife fights and federal investigations that existed nowhere except the rumor mill. Once in October, someone had slid a note into her locker with a single word on it that Walter never learned, because Sierra never told anyone. But he saw her read it in the hallway and watched her face go very still and very practiced, the way a person's face gets when they've had a lot of practice not reacting. Walter recognized that look. He'd worn it himself, walking into a grocery store and seeing his ex-wife and Greg picking out cantaloupes like a catalog photo of happiness. He started, without entirely deciding to, paying a little more attention to Sierra Mercer, not in a way that drew notice, just enough to notice things back. Funny how courage rarely announces itself. Most people imagine bravery looks like charging into battle, throwing a punch, making a speech that gets applauded. In reality, it usually looks smaller and stupider than that. It looks like a tired man in a cardigan deciding, for no reward he can name, not to look away. The incident happened on a Thursday in late October, 3 weeks before the bikers came. It started with a missing tablet computer, one of 40 the district had purchased for the AP History elective, numbered and assigned, tracked through an app that logged location data nobody fully understood. Tablet 17 went missing from the supply closet on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the app's last known location pinged from a coordinate that, when cross-referenced against student addresses by an assistant administrator with more enthusiasm than sense, happened to match a property 3 doors down from the Mercer house. It wasn't Sierra's address. It was a neighbor's. Nobody checked that detail before the story started moving. By lunch on Thursday, half the junior class had decided Sierra Mercer stole school property and probably sold it, because that's the kind of thing people in Sierra's family did, wasn't it? By the time the vice principal, a clipped, ambitious man named Aaron Feltz, called Sierra into his office, the story had already calcified into fact in the building's collective imagination, the way rumors do when they confirm something people already wanted to believe. Feltz didn't have proof. He had a location ping 3 doors off, a kid with a complicated last name, and what he later described without apparent irony as a strong sense of probability. He suspended Sierra for 3 days pending investigation, in front of 2 other students, in a hallway, loudly enough that it would be all over the school inside the hour. Sierra didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just nodded once, the way someone nods when they've decided arguing won't change anything and never has, and walked to the front office to wait for a ride. Walter found out 20 minutes later from Pranav, who'd come to his classroom during a free period looking like he might be sick. "She didn't do it," Pranav said. "She was at debate practice when that tablet went missing. I was there. I told Mr. Feltz. He said the location data was compelling." Walter sat very still for a moment, the way a man sits when he's doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. Then he got up, walked down the hall, and did something he had not done in 11 years of teaching at Marsh County High. He went into Aaron Feltz's office without an appointment and closed the door behind him. What happened in that office took 4 minutes, and 3 different versions of it would circulate by the end of the week, 2 of them wildly inaccurate. What actually happened was this. Walter asked, calmly, whether anyone had checked the debate team's attendance log for Tuesday afternoon. Feltz said the location data was fairly conclusive. Walter pointed out that the location data placed the device 3 houses away from the Mercer residence, not at it. and asked whether anyone had considered that perhaps a different student, one who didn't carry 30 years of small-town mythology behind her name, might have been the more obvious subject of inquiry. Feltz, who did not enjoy being corrected by a man who still used an overhead projector, said this wasn't really Walter's department. Walter said he'd make it his department then, because he'd taught Sierra Mercer for 2 months, and what he'd observed was a serious, careful, somewhat lonely kid who did her own work, and didn't have a motive to risk her GPA stealing a $600 tablet she could checked out legally with a form. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. Walter didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten to go to the board, though the thought crossed his mind. He simply refused to leave the office until Feltz agreed to actually pull the debate attendance records before finalizing anything. Feltz agreed, mostly to end the conversation. He did not, in fact, pull the records that day or the next. But word got out that Walter Doss had gone to bat for the biker girl. And in a town like Marsh County, that single fact did more damage to Walter's standing in the building than anything he'd done in a decade of quiet competence. By the following Monday, the consequences had begun arriving in the small, deniable ways institutions punish people they can't officially punish. His department chair reorganized the schedule so that Walter's planning period, the one slot of quiet he had each day, was now occupied by a mandatory committee meeting about hallway pass procedures. 2 parents emailed the office, unprompted, expressing concern that Mr. Doss seems to be taking sides in a serious safety matter. A colleague who'd eaten lunch with Walter every day for 6 years started eating in her car instead, and when he asked if everything was okay, she said she just needed some quiet time, in a tone that made clear quiet time had started exactly when this started. Feltz, for his part, became cooler and more procedural every time their paths crossed, as if Walter had become a liability to be managed rather than a colleague to be spoken with. Walter told himself it didn't matter. He told himself this while eating dinner standing at his kitchen counter, the way he always did, except now there was a new flavor to the silence in his apartment, not just loneliness, but the specific ache of having done the right thing and discovered that the right thing doesn't always come with a receipt. Twice that week he found himself looking up job listings in other districts. Once, very late at night, he typed, "Is it worth it?" into a search bar and then deleted it before he could see what came up, embarrassed at himself for asking the internet a question he should been able to answer on his own. He didn't regret what he'd done, but for the first time in a long time, he genuinely wondered if he was the only person in the building who thought it mattered. One thing I've learned watching teenagers move through the world is that they can survive algebra, survive their first heartbreak, survive cafeteria mystery meat that should probably be classified as a biohazard. But surviving a rumor, that takes a different kind of stamina, the kind nobody gives out medals for. Word reached Dutch Mercer the way most important things reached him sideways, through someone who knew someone. It was his sister-in-law, Carol, who worked the front desk at a tire shop 2 blocks from the school and heard everything before everyone. She called Dutch on a Thursday evening while he was in his garage, elbow-deep in a 1978 shovelhead he'd been rebuilding for the better part of a year, and told him what she'd heard. That Sierra had been suspended over a tablet she didn't take, that the vice principal hadn't bothered checking her alibi, and that one teacher, just one, had gone into that man's office and made him slow down and actually look at the facts. Dutch didn't say much on the phone. That wasn't his way. He thanked Carol, hung up, and sat on an overturned bucket in his garage for a long time, wiping grease off his hands with a rag that had stopped being useful for that purpose years ago. People who didn't know Dutch Mercer assumed things about him based on the patch on his back and the scar through his left eyebrow, courtesy of a bar fight in 1994 he'd long since stopped being proud of. What they didn't know was that Dutch had raised Sierra alone since she was 4, after her mother left for reasons that were nobody's business but his and Sierra's. They didn't know he'd missed exactly one of her school events in 12 years, and that was because he'd been in the hospital with a collapsed lung from a highway accident that wasn't his fault. They didn't know he kept every report card she'd ever brought home in a metal box in his closet, organized by year, like a man's CATALOGUING proof that he hadn't ruined anything. What Dutch felt, sitting on that bucket, wasn't rage exactly. It was something quieter and heavier. It was the particular grief of a father who has spent years watching his daughter pay a tax on a life she never asked to inherit, judged for a name, suspected for a face, lonely in a building full of people her own age, and being unable to do a single thing about it, because showing up himself would only confirm every story the town already told about people like him. And then someone had done something. A stranger, a man with no reason to risk anything for a kid who wasn't his. Dutch didn't sleep much that night. He sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad and started making calls instead. What happened over the next several days happened almost entirely out of view, in a network of phone calls, group chats, and conversations at gas stations that no algorithm could have tracked and no school administrator had any idea was occurring. It started small. Dutch called REYES, the chapter president, and told him what had happened. REYES called 2 other chapters in neighboring counties, men he'd known for 25 years, men whose own kids had grown up getting the same sideways look Sierra got. Word moved the way it moves in tight communities, fast, informal, and impossible to trace back to a single origin point. Nobody outside that network knew what was being planned. Phelps didn't know. Principal OKAFOR didn't know. Walter Das, grading essays at his kitchen counter and wondering if he'd made a career-ending mistake for a kid he barely knew, certainly didn't know. All anyone in the school could sense, in the days leading up to that Tuesday, was a strange undercurrent, Sierra, seeming slightly less guarded at lunch. A few hushed conversations between Dutch and people who weren't from Marsh County, motorcycles passing through town in 2s and 3s that nobody quite connected to anything. The mystery deepened on Monday afternoon, when Sierra herself was called down to the front office, not in trouble this time, but for what the secretary described mysteriously as a phone call from your father that he wanted you to take privately. Sierra came out of that call with an expression nobody could quite read. Not upset, not exactly happy either. Something more like a person recalibrating an entire understanding of her own life in real time. She didn't tell anyone what was said, not even PRANAV. Now we arrive back where we started. Tuesday morning, 8:10 a.m., 300 motorcycles lined along Route 9 and packed into a parking lot built for 120 cars. Here's where most stories like this would rush straight to the big reveal. But that's not how it happened, and rushing wouldn't do it justice. For nearly 4 full minutes, nothing happened at all. 300 engines went silent almost in unison, an arranged, deliberate quiet that was somehow more unnerving than the noise had been. Riders dismounted in formation, removing helmets, standing beside their bikes without moving toward the building. No one spoke. No one approached the doors. Inside, Principal OKAFOR had already called the county sheriff's non-emergency line, her voice admirably level given the circumstances, while simultaneously instructing staff over the intercom to keep students in their first period classrooms. Teachers stood at windows they'd been told to keep their classes away from. A few students filmed anyway, phones pressed to glass, captions already forming in their heads. Walter Das stood at the back of his own classroom, 26 confused juniors behind him, watching 300 strangers stand in total silence outside a building that suddenly felt very small. He had, by this point, put together roughly half the picture, and the half he'd put together terrified him. He assumed, reasonably, given everything he knew about how these things were portrayed, that this was retaliation. That somehow word had reached Dutch Mercer that his daughter had been humiliated, and that this was a show of force, an intimidation, the kind of thing that ends with someone's career and possibly worse. He thought about Feltz, sequestered somewhere in the building, and felt, despite everything, a flicker of guilt on the man's behalf. Whatever Feltz had done wrong, he hadn't signed up for this. Then the front doors of the school opened, not because anyone outside pushed them, but because Sierra Mercer, who had quietly excused herself from her third-period class 4 minutes earlier under circumstances nobody yet understood, walked out through them. The entire lot of 300 people turned to look at her at once. And then they began, one by one, to applaud. At this point, half the building expected chaos. The other half, frankly, expected to see their photo on the evening news standing next to a reporter using the word incident a lot. Nobody, not the principal, not the sheriff's deputy who just arrived and was now standing very still in the doorway with his hand nowhere near his holster, not even Walter Das, who knew more than most, guessed what was actually about to happen. Dutch Mercer stepped forward from the crowd, helmet under one arm, and asked, in a voice that carried easily across a silent parking lot, whether a Mr. Walter Das could come outside. Inside, word reached Walter's classroom within 90 seconds, delivered by a student aide who looked like she might pass out from the responsibility. Walter felt his stomach drop somewhere around his shoes. He told his class to stay seated, walked down the hallway past Principal Acaffer, who simply nodded at him, her expression unreadable, as if she, too, had decided there was no version of this morning where staying inside was the safer option, and stepped out the front doors of Marsh County High School into the strangest scene of his professional life. 300 faces turned toward him. Sierra stood near her father, and for the first time since Walter had known her, she wasn't wearing the careful, practiced stillness she usually wore in public. She looked, instead, almost embarrassed, the specific embarrassment of a teenager watching adults make a much bigger deal out of something than she'd expected. Dutch Mercer walked up to Walter and extended a hand roughly the size of a dinner plate. "Mr. Das," he said, "you don't know me, I'm Sierra's father." Walter shook his hand, aware that every phone in a 50-yard radius, student and biker alike, was now recording. "I think I might be in trouble," Walter said, because it was the first honest thing that came to mind, and a ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, breaking some of the tension like a window cracking open. "No," Dutch said, "you're not in trouble. You're the reason I'm standing here instead of somewhere I shouldn't be." And then Dutch told the story, not just to Walter, but to the crowd of students now pressed against every window of the building, to Principal Acaffer standing in the doorway, to the sheriff's deputy who had quietly put away his radio and was now just listening like everyone else. He told them that 12 years ago, when Sierra was 4 and her mother had just left, Dutch had nearly lost everything. Not the club, not the garage, his mind. He told them, in front of 300 people and a crowd of stunned teenagers, something he had never said publicly in his life, that there had been a stretch of about 8 months where he didn't think he was going to make it as a father, where the weight of raising a daughter alone, while everyone in town assumed the worst about him, had nearly broken something in him that doesn't always come back once it breaks. What had pulled him through, he said, wasn't the club, though the club had helped. It was a man, a teacher as it happened, at a different school in a different town, 40 miles east, who had taken an interest in a quiet, struggling 4-year-old's older cousin, a boy named Marcus who'd been failing every class and on track to drop out entirely, and who had spent 2 years after school, unpaid and unasked, tutoring that boy until he graduated. That boy was now a paramedic. That boy was Dutch's nephew, and that teacher, Dutch said, had never once asked what family Marcus came from, never once treated him differently for the patch his uncle wore. That teacher's name was Walter Das, Dutch said. The parking lot went very quiet. Walter, for his part, looked like a man who'd just been hit with something heavier than a motorcycle. This was the twist nobody saw coming, including Walter himself, who hadn't connected Marcus Reyna, a kid he'd tutored 11 years ago, before his divorce, before the apartment over the laundromat, back when he still believed every struggling student was a book he could help finish, to Dutch Mercer at all. He'd had no idea Marcus was Dutch's nephew. He'd had no idea, helping a struggling 14-year-old with algebra in an empty classroom over a decade ago, that he was quietly building a debt that an entire motorcycle club would remember for the rest of their lives. "I didn't know," Walter said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words, which surprised him more than anyone. "You weren't supposed to know," Dutch said. "That's kind of the point of doing something decent. You're not supposed to be keeping score." Sierra stepped forward then, and this was the second piece nobody had expected, including Sierra herself just 5 days earlier. Because what nobody at Marsh County High knew, what Sierra hadn't told even Pranav, was that on the night she'd been suspended, while everyone assumed she'd been crying or panicking, she had instead gone home and quietly pulled the building's public Wi-Fi router logs, something she knew how to do because she'd spent a summer building websites for her father's garage and understood networks better than most adults in that building. She'd found, buried in administrative metadata nobody at the school had thought to check, that Tablet 17 had last connected to the building's network from a classroom 3 full hallways from where she'd been at the time, a classroom belonging to a sophomore named Curtis Pell, whose family happened to be close friends with Vice President Feltz, and who had, it would later come out, sold the tablet to a kid in another district for $60 and a fishing rod. Sierra hadn't gone to Feltz with this. She'd gone to her father, partly out of fear nobody would believe her over a name like Pell, and partly, she admitted later, because some small, wounded part of her had stopped expecting the school to be fair to her at all. What Dutch had done with that information was not what anyone in the parking lot expected, and it was the final twist of the morning, the one that recontextualized everything that came before it. Dutch hadn't called 300 bikers to intimidate anyone. He hadn't called them to confront Feltz or threaten the district, or even primarily to thank Walter, though that was part of it. He'd called them because for years, Dutch Mercer had quietly run a scholarship and mentorship fund out of his own pocket and the pooled contributions of writers across 4 counties, a fund specifically for kids who'd been written off, misjudged, or failed by systems that decided who they were before bothering to ask. It had no name. It had no website. It operated almost entirely through word of mouth, the same way the rumor that had once destroyed Walter's standing in the building had spread. And what Dutch announced that morning, standing in the parking lot of Marsh County High School with 300 riders behind him and an entire stunned student body pressed against the windows, was that the fund, quietly, for years, had been paying for things nobody in town had ever traced back to its source. The new wing on the public library, 11 full-ride scholarships for kids from families the town had written off. The youth center 2 blocks from the tire shop, the one everyone assumed a grant had paid for. And as of that morning, a new scholarship, established in Walter Doss's name, for any student in the district who'd been failed once by people who should have looked closer, funded permanently, administered not by the district, but by a board that would include, at Dutch's insistence, both Sierra Mercer and Walter Doss himself. It's strange when you sit with it. Sometimes one decent decision, made by a tired man with nothing to gain, echoes farther and longer than 1,000 impressive speeches ever could. Walter Doss spent 2 years tutoring a struggling kid named Marcus for nothing but the satisfaction of watching someone improve. He never collected on it. He never expected to. And 11 years later, it came back to him in the form of 300 motorcycles and a debt he never knew he was owed. What happened in the weeks that followed unfolded the way these things tend to. Once the initial shock wears off and ordinary life reasserts itself, though nothing in Marsh County stayed quite as ordinary as it had been. Curtis Pell was quietly disciplined once the network logs were formally reviewed by the district. The same evidence Sierra had found a week earlier, finally taken seriously now that 300 people had made it impossible to ignore. Aaron Feltz issued a stiff, lawyer-reviewed apology to Sierra that satisfied almost no one, and resigned from the district 8 months later to take an administrative job in a county 2 hours away, where as far as anyone in Marsh County knew, he continued correcting people's grammar in meetings. Principal Acaffer, to her credit, used the moment as leverage to overhaul the school's disciplinary review process, instituting a rule that no suspension based on digital evidence could be finalized without a documented attempt to verify alibi witnesses, a policy that would later be adopted in modified form by 2 neighboring districts. Sierra Mercer finished the year with a 3.9 GPA, joined the debate team Pranav had been begging her to join for 2 years, and stopped, gradually, wearing the careful stillness she'd worn for most of high school. She still got looks sometimes when her father picked her up on the bike instead of in the truck, but the looks changed. Less fear, more curiosity. A few eventually became something close to admiration. Walter Das did not, in the end, quit teaching. He thought about it less, in fact, than he had in 3 years. The scholarship board gave him something he hadn't realized he was missing, a reason to believe that the small, unglamorous work of paying attention to kids nobody else bothered to really see still mattered, even when it felt invisible, even when it cost him at the time. He and Dutch Mercer became, against every expectation either of them might have once had, genuine friends. Dutch taught Walter to ride badly on an old Triumph that spent more time being repaired than ridden. Walter, in turn, started tutoring 2 more kids from the funds list, kids nobody else in town had bothered to look at twice. There is one more piece to this story, and it's the kind of detail that doesn't show up in the dramatic version, the version that gets summarized in headlines and recapped breathlessly online. It's smaller than that. It's also, in its way, the truest part. 6 months after the bikers came to Marsh County High School, Walter Das got a card in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photograph, an old one, slightly yellowed, of a 14-year-old boy and a much younger Walter, standing in front of a chalkboard covered in algebra problems, both of them grinning like they'd just won something. On the back, in handwriting Walter didn't recognize, were 6 words. Marcus kept this, now you should. Walter never found out for certain who sent it. He had a guess. He kept the photograph on his desk anyway, next to the world's OKAYESD teacher mug, where it sat through the rest of that year and every year after, a small reminder that the work nobody applauds is very often the work that matters most, and that somewhere, almost always, somebody is keeping score, even when you've long since stopped expecting them to. The teacher had believed, in the simplest terms, that he'd protected one student from an unfair accusation. What he never fully understood, even years later, was that kindness, the quiet, unglamorous, thankless kind, has a way of traveling farther than the person who offers it ever gets to see. It had been teaching the entire town long before 300 motorcycles ever showed up to prove it.